Mastering Photography. Lesson 1. Exposure modes and the exposure triangle. This is all about taking control of exposure. Exposure and ISO. You need to ensure that the correct amount of light reaches your sensor or film to ensure that the image is correctly exposed. That is, not too light or not too dark. I would hope that is fairly obvious. The amount of light that is required for correct exposure depends on the sensitivity of your film, which is measured in ISO, or in the case of a digital camera, your chosen ISO setting. ISO ratings of films are typically in the range of ISO 50 through to ISO 800, although slower films and also faster films do exist. With modern digital cameras, they generally have a base ISO of either 100 or 200 ISO, and they allow the user to select a higher ISO of up to 12,800, or in some cases a lot higher. The higher the number, the greater the sensitivity. For example, ISO 100 requires twice as much light as ISO 200 for correct exposure, and ISO 1600 requires twice as much light as ISO 3200. You get the idea. Normally the photographer will want to choose the lowest ISO he or she can get away with for a given situation, because the lower the ISO, the greater the image quality. Digital cameras normally have a base ISO, which is usually 100 or 200. With any setting above that, the camera is applying gain. The problem with this is the more applied gain, the higher the noise and the lower the image quality. Therefore, do not use a higher ISO setting on your digital camera than you need, otherwise you will be compromising image quality. Film grain is usually more visible than digital noise, although arguably not as nasty looking as digital noise. Sometimes film photographers will use a higher ISO film than they need in order to accentuate noise as a creative decision. But generally, you will use the lowest ISO you can get away with, whether you're a film photographer or a digital photographer. I had to shoot this image at a very high ISO because it was at a concert where the lighting was very poor. You can see that the noise on this image is very noticeable. On this image, I shot this at the camera's base ISO. You can see the image quality is far higher, and you will not notice any noise even at quite large print sizes. Controlling the amount of light reaching your sensor. There's two ways in which you control this. One, shutter speed. Two, your aperture setting on the lens. An image is captured on the film or digital sensor by opening the camera's shutter to allow light to pass through it. Shutter speed is the duration of time that the shutter remains open. The longer it is open, the more light passes through to the sensor. Shutter speeds on modern cameras typically range from 30 seconds or half a minute all the way down to 1/4000th of a second. That's quite a range. A 30-second exposure is allowing 120,000 times more light to reach the sensor than a shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second. The aperture. Right. The aperture is the size of the opening inside the lens through which light passes. The aperture is made up of overlapping blades, and the opening is variable and controlled by a diaphragm mechanism in the lens. With a DSLR or SLR, the image you see in the viewfinder is always viewed at the maximum aperture of the lens, irrespective of the current aperture setting. This is not true of mirrorless cameras, but I'll discuss that in a future video. When you press the shutter button halfway, or you press the shutter button all the way rather, to take the image, The lens then stops down to the preset aperture while the shutter is open, and then returns back to the maximum aperture once the shutter has closed again. The different aperture settings on a lens are referred to as f-stops. On some cameras, the aperture is set using an aperture ring on the lens, and with others, it is controlled by, or it's set by a control on the camera body. Some camera systems even give you the option of doing it either way. The common range of f-stops on lenses are f1.4, f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16 and f22. Each step halves or doubles the light through the lens and is one f-stop of difference. The smaller the number, the larger the aperture. That's a very important point to remember. So f2 is a large aperture, f32 is a very small aperture. The maximum aperture setting available on the lens depends on the lens design. It typically ranges from f1.4 to f5.6. Cheaper lenses generally have smaller maximum apertures, and also zoom lenses tend to have smaller maximum apertures than prime or fixed focal length lenses. Long telephoto lenses typically also have smaller maximum apertures than shorter focal length lenses. Okay, right, I've got a question for you. If, for example, your camera's meter indicates that at an aperture of f2.8, you will need a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second, then what shutter speed would you have to select if you change the aperture to f11? So you've decided you want more depth of field, so an f11 aperture is more appropriate, but how would that affect the shutter speed? Well, you can see by looking at this table of f-stop numbers, f2.8 is 4 stops larger than f11. It therefore follows that your shutter speed will need to be 4 stops slower in order to get the same exposure. Therefore, you will need a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second instead of 1/1000th of a second. This figure is arrived at by halving the shutter speed, or doubling the shutter speed 4 times, because there's 4 stops of change. The exposure triangle. You'll often see this term mentioned when studying photography. It's quite a simple concept, really. The exposure triangle is basically the relationship between those 3 parameters that determine the exposure. These parameters are, of course, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. We have learned already that they are interdependent upon one another. For example, if you have the ISO at 400, the shutter speed at 1/500th of a second, and the aperture at f5.6, and you then decrease the ISO to 200, so that's 1 stop of change, then you would need to decrease the shutter speed to 1/250th of a second, or increase the aperture to f4 in order to maintain the same correct exposure. Considerations when choosing aperture. Firstly, I need to say that the f-stop you choose has a major bearing on the amount of depth of field in your photograph. A shallow depth of field means that there will be relatively little in focus in front of or behind of your point of focus. For example, if you're shooting a portrait shot, then generally you will want the background to be defocused to some extent in order to draw the viewer's attention to the subject, to the person being photographed. A sharply focused background in a portrait shot is usually distracting and not what you want in a portrait shot. Although as in anything, there are some exceptions. On the other hand, if you're taking a landscape shot where you've got some mountain range in the distance, but you've also got some foreground interest as well, you need a large depth of field so that the whole thing is in focus from a few meters away all the way through to infinity. The larger the aperture, i.e. the smaller the f-stop number, the more shallow the depth of field will be. For example, you will get far shallower depth of field at f2.8 than you would at f11. The subject distance and also the focal length of the lens also have a major bearing on the depth of field, but I will discuss this in much more detail in a future video. Apart from the depth of field, there's another consideration when choosing your aperture for a shot. Virtually all lenses will produce their best image quality in terms of sharpness, saturation and contrast at an f-stop in the middle of the range, which is typically f5.6 or f8. A lot of lenses will give rather soft, low contrast images at their maximum aperture, although some will give good or even very good image quality when wide open. It all depends on the design of the lens and how much you're paying for it. At smaller apertures, say smaller than f11, images can start to look a little bit softer. This is due to a phenomenon called diffraction. Diffraction affects all lenses at progressively smaller aperture settings. It doesn't matter how good your lens is, how expensive it is, whether it's a Zeiss lens or something considerably cheaper, diffraction will affect all lenses at small apertures. Considerations when setting the shutter speed. If you're hand holding the camera, then you must avoid setting the shutter speed too low, otherwise the slightest movement of the camera will result in blur in your image. But how slow is too slow? Well, it depends on the focal length of your lens. The longer the focal length of the lens, the greater the magnification, which has the effect of magnifying any camera shake. A useful rule of thumb is that for hand holding, the shutter speed should be no slower than the reciprocal of the focal length of the lens. I'll explain what that means. For example, when using a 28mm lens and hand holding, the slowest safe shutter speed will be 1/28th of a second or 1/30th of a second. For a 50mm lens, you should go no slower than 1/50th of a second, and for a 200mm lens, no slower than 1/200th of a second. You get the idea. Many photographers use zoom lenses rather than fixed focal length or prime lenses, so when using the zoom, you need to keep track of what you've currently got your focal length set at. Otherwise, you could find yourself using too slow a shutter speed for hand holding if you're not careful. This is particularly important if you're using one of the popular super zoom lenses that have a very wide zoom range. For example, an 18 to 200mm or a 28 to 300mm lens. You also need to think about subject movement as well as camera movement. If your subject is moving, then you may well need a much higher shutter speed in order to freeze that motion. How fast you would need to go there would depend on how fast your subject is moving. Many cameras have some form of optical image stabilization built into the lens or built into the camera body, or in some cases incorporated into both. Although lens-based stabilization is more common than camera body-based. Different camera manufacturers have different names for their version of it. Nikon call theirs VR, which is short for vibration reduction. Canon call theirs IS, you can guess what that stands for. And Fujifilm call theirs OIS, Optical Image Stabilization. Image stabilization allows you to handhold at slower shutter speeds than would otherwise be possible. the improvement generally varies from 2 stops to 4 stops. So if with 2 stops of improvement, if you have a 200mm lens, then instead of having to shoot at least 1/250th of a second, you could go as low as 1/50th of a second. That's with 2 stops improvement, or as low as 1/12th of a second if your system is offering you 4 stops of improvement. It's important to note here, however, that image stabilization or optical image stabilization only helps with camera movement. It does nothing to help when your subject is moving. Camera exposure modes. Most modern cameras have various exposure modes available to the user. I'll run through them all here. Firstly, full auto mode, program mode, aperture priority, shutter priority, and full manual mode. Okay, let's talk about full auto mode first. This is generally what most users would choose if they're beginners, if they've just bought the camera, they've not yet read the instruction manual that came with it, and they just want to get shooting straight away, getting hopefully decent images. In full auto mode, it's basically point and shoot. The camera will set the ISO setting, shutter speed and aperture itself. It'll also decide whether the flash should fire or not. Point and shoot. All you have to do is focus, which will usually be automatic anyway, and take the shot. So in such a mode, you're not having any creative control whatsoever. Next, we've got program mode. This is a similar idea, except there's slightly less automation, in that you decide whether you fire your flash or not, and you will also have the option of selecting the ISO setting yourself rather than the camera having to do that for you. Although the shutter speed and aperture will both be chosen by the camera, so you've still got no creative control there, or very, very little. Now it starts to get interesting. The modes that give us more creative control. Aperture priority. This is an automatic mode, but it's one in which you choose what aperture you want to use. So that gives you full control of the depth of field in your shot. And it also gives you the option of choosing a middle aperture for maximum sharpness, if that's what you're looking for, depending on the situation. Also, aperture priority can be useful when you want the highest possible shutter speed for a given ISO setting. In which case, what you would do is set your aperture to the largest setting, i.e. the smallest number, and then the camera, that would cause the camera to choose the fastest shutter speed for the particular ISO setting that you're using. Okay, shutter priority. As you might guess, this is where the photographer chooses the shutter speed, and then the camera will select the appropriate aperture to give correct exposure. This is a mode you would choose where the shutter speed is the most important parameter. For example, typically if you're shooting sports or wildlife or anything where your subject is moving, you don't always want to use this mode to select a high shutter speed to freeze action. Sometimes you might want deliberate motion blur, depending on what you're trying to achieve. But this mode would give you the control to do that. Right, finally we've got manual mode, full manual mode. As you might guess, this is where you select everything yourself. You know, the aperture setting and also the shutter speed. You can set those in conjunction with the camera's built-in light meter as a guide to help you get the correct exposure, or you could use an external light meter, or you could use some other method to try and ensure correct exposure. You will hear a lot of people referring to manual mode as the professional mode. That's not really the case. Although a lot of professionals will use manual mode, they will use it when they have to. Okay. Typically in difficult lighting situations where the camera's meter might be fooled into setting incorrect exposure. One final thing to note, auto ISO may be used with aperture and shutter priority modes, obviously, and with program modes in digital cameras. But some cameras, notably Nikon's, but others as well, will allow you to use auto ISO with manual mode. So that's quite interesting, because what you're then getting is a new form of auto mode. Although you've got it set to manual, the ISO is automatic. This could be useful, for example, if you're doing some bird photography, you have a lens with a maximum aperture of f4, but at f4 you find the image quality a little soft, so you want to lock it down to f5.6. But also you want to ensure that you've got a high enough shutter speed to freeze any movement of the subject. So what you could do, for example, is set your aperture to f5.6 and set a suitably fast shutter speed to meet your needs, and then the camera would just automatically set the correct ISO to give correct exposure. That can be very useful. In summary, the three parameters that determine exposure are ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, or f-stop number. The exposure triangle is the relationship between those three parameters. The longer the lens, the higher the shutter speed is needed for hand holding. Fast shutter speeds are needed to freeze subject movement. Large apertures have small f-stop numbers, for example f2, and small apertures have large f-stop numbers, for example f16. The larger the aperture, the smaller the depth of field. That is, the more blurred the background. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, is to take full control of your image making. Choose aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual mode. I hope you found this video useful. If so, please share, click the thumbs up, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you. Bye.